"You should never have been on that road. It was too dangerous that night." The Duke's voice was a low growl, the words slicing through the tense air of the library. Marianne froze, her hand hovering over a worn volume of poetry. "What road, Your Grace?" she asked, her heart beginning a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. "You dismissed me at the Weatherby ball. We went straight home." A flicker of something, raw and unguarded, crossed his face before the mask of cold indifference slammed back into place. The discrepancy hung between them, a shocking, jagged piece of a puzzle she never knew existed. The story she had told herself for 5 years, the story of a cruel rejection and a broken heart, was beginning to unravel. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The rain was a merciless, hammering force, a physical assault that had long since soaked through the thin wool of Marianne Holt's dress. It plastered her hair to her scalp and ran in cold rivulets down her back, each drop a fresh reminder of her utter desolation. Her body trembled, not just from the biting October wind, but from a deep, soul-shaking exhaustion that had been her constant companion for weeks. Before her loomed the gates of Ravensworth Manor, a monstrous confection of wrought iron twisted into snarling beasts and thorny roses, their blackness stark against the bruised purple of the storm-racked sky. This was it. The place she had sworn on her father's grave she would never return to, the very epicenter of her life's ruin. This was her last, most humiliating resort. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. It had been stripped from her layer by layer, first by her father's sudden death, then by the shocking discovery of his ruinous debts, and finally by the cold, decisive cruelty of her uncle, who had turned her out of her own home with nothing but the clothes on her back and a pittance that had run out days ago. The journey from London had been a blur of muddy roads and aching feet, of sleeping in barns and accepting crusts of bread from farmers' wives, whose pitying glances were almost as sharp as the hunger pangs in her belly. Each mile had been a step further from the life she had known, and a step closer to this final, desperate gamble. She had hitched rides on rattling farm carts, the straw pricking her skin, the smell of damp earth and manure filling her senses. All the while the spectre of Ravensworth and its master haunted her waking thoughts and her fitful, shivering dreams. Her hand, numb and blue with cold, trembled as she reached for the heavy, lion-headed knocker. The metal was frigid, unforgiving, and for a moment she hesitated, the sheer weight of her shame threatening to crush her. What was she doing? Begging for scraps at the table of the man who had so publicly and callously shattered her heart. The memory was as vivid as if it were yesterday, not 5 years ago. The glittering ballroom, the scent of beeswax and expensive perfume, the cruel, dismissive words he had spoken, loud enough for half of society to hear. He had made her a laughingstock, a pariah, and now she stood at his gate like a common beggar. The wind howled, whipping a strand of wet hair across her face, stinging her eyes. She had no choice. Taking a ragged breath that felt like swallowing shards of ice, she lifted the knocker and let it fall. The sound was a deafening clang, an insolent boom that seemed to mock the oppressive Gothic grandeur of the manor. Silence followed, a long, drawn-out silence where the only sounds were the drumming of the rain and the frantic, terrified thumping of her own heart. She was about to turn away, to let the storm swallow her whole, when the heavy oak door groaned open. But it was not a liveried footman or a stern butler who stood silhouetted in the warm, golden light of the hall. It was him, Duke Sebastian Ravensworth. He was even more imposing than she remembered, taller, broader in the shoulder, his presence filling the doorway, a bulwark against the storm. His dark hair was artfully disheveled, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, were just as intense, just as piercing. They widened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine shock that he could not quite contain. And then it was gone, replaced by a mask of cold, unreadable fury that was somehow more terrifying than open rage. A faint, silvery scar, one she did not remember, cut a line from his temple to the sharp edge of his jaw, making his severe expression seem even more intimidating. He looked at her drenched and pathetic form, and his jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing in his cheek. "Miss Holt," he said, and his voice was like ice, each word a perfectly formed, frozen shard. "This is a surprise. I had heard you had removed from London." The coldness of his tone was a physical blow, but Marianne lifted her chin, a resilient flicker of pride, the only thing keeping her upright. Her teeth chattered so violently she could barely form the words. "Your Grace," she began, her voice a raw, broken whisper. "I apologize for the intrusion. I have nowhere else to go." The admission was agony, a final surrender of her dignity. "I beg for shelter, just for the night." A figure materialized behind the Duke, a tall, thin man with a face so pinched with disapproval it seemed to have been carved from a lemon. "Your Grace, shall I send for the constable?" the man said, his voice dripping with disdain. "We have no room for vagrants." Before Sebastian could answer, a softer presence bustled forward, a plump, grey-haired woman in a housekeeper's uniform, her face a roadmap of kindness and concern, rushed past the Duke, a thick woolen blanket in her hands. "Good heavens, the child is frozen solid!" she exclaimed, her voice warm and blessedly human. She wrapped the blanket around Marianne's trembling shoulders, the rough wool a small miracle of warmth. "Come in, dear, come in this instant. Finch, have the kitchen send up broth and bread." The butler, Finch, looked scandalized, but the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, paid him no mind, her focus entirely on Marianne. Sebastian watched the scene, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. The sight of her, so broken and desperate on his doorstep, had dredged up a past he had violently suppressed for 5 long years. He was a man at war with himself, his cold exterior a fortress built to contain a raging inner conflict, bound by a rigid, unspoken code of honor, and perhaps a flicker of something deeper, something he refused to name. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "See to Miss Holt," he commanded, his voice clipped and devoid of any warmth. He turned on his heel without another word and disappeared into the shadows of the vast hall, leaving Marianne in the capable, compassionate hands of Mrs. Gable. The West Wing guest suite was a world away from the cold, muddy road she had just left. It was a gilded cage of breathtaking opulence. A fire already roared in the marble fireplace, its flames dancing and casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. The furniture was heavy and dark, polished to a high sheen, the chairs and chaise lounge upholstered in deep blue velvet that seemed to drink the light. The air smelled of beeswax, dried lavender, and old money, a scent so familiar and yet so alien now. Mrs. Gable led her to a connecting chamber, where a deep, claw-footed bathtub was already being filled with steaming water by a young, wide-eyed maid. "Get yourself into a hot bath, dear," Mrs. Gable said gently, her eyes full of a pity that did not sting. "It will chase the chill from your bones. I've laid out one of my own nightgowns for you. It's not silk, I'm afraid, but it's clean and warm. We'll have your dress dried and cleaned by morning." Left alone, Marianne stripped off her wet, mud-caked clothes, leaving them in a miserable heap on the floor. Sinking into the hot, fragrant water was a pleasure so intense it was almost painful. The heat seeped into her aching muscles, into her very bones, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something other than cold and hunger. But as the warmth soothed her body, it loosened the tight guard she had kept on her memories. They washed over her, relentless and cruel. She remembered Sebastian's courtship, the stolen glances across crowded ballrooms, the way his deep voice would soften when he spoke to her, the shared laughter over a book of poetry. He had been charming, intelligent, and for a few blissful months, she had allowed herself to believe he was sincere. She had fallen in love with the promise in his eyes. Then came the Weatherby Ball, the pinnacle of the season. She had worn a new gown of pale blue silk, her heart fluttering with an excitement that felt like a premonition of joy. He had sought her out the moment she arrived, but the man who greeted her was a stranger. The warmth in his eyes was gone, replaced by a chilling indifference. He had made a show of speaking to her, his voice carrying in the suddenly quiet room. He'd commented on her gown, his words laced with a subtle, cutting mockery. He'd questioned her father's business dealings with a sneer, implying they were common and grasping. And then, the final brutal blow. "One must be so careful about the company one keeps, Miss Holt," he had said, his voice like the crack of a whip. "Reputations are so easily tarnished." He had turned his back on her then, leaving her standing alone in a circle of stunned silence, the whispers and titters of the ton rising around her like a tide of poison. The public humiliation had been absolute. Her father, his face ashen, had escorted her home in silence. The light had gone out of his eyes that night. Within a month, a bad investment had collapsed. the final straw for a man whose spirit was already broken. He had caught a fever and was gone within a week. It was only after his death that the full extent of their ruin was revealed. Sebastian's rejection had not just broken her heart, it had shattered her world. And now, 5 years later, she was here, accepting his reluctant charity, a ghost haunting the halls of her own past, trapped in a gilded cage built by the very man who had destroyed her. The hot water stung her eyes, or perhaps it was just the first tears she had allowed herself to shed in a very, very long time. A soft knock at the door startled her from her reverie. "Miss Holt?" It was Mrs. Gable's kind voice. "His Grace requests your presence for dinner in the main hall." Marianne's heart sank. The thought of facing him again, of sitting across a table from him under his cold, judgmental gaze, was almost more than she could bear. But she was a guest, or rather, a charity case, in his home. She had no right to refuse. Dressed in the simple borrowed nightgown and a heavy velvet dressing robe Mrs. Gable had provided, she followed the housekeeper through a labyrinth of silent, echoing corridors. The dining hall was a cavernous, intimidating space, designed to impress and overwhelm. A single, impossibly long table of dark, polished wood stretched down its center, capable of seating 50 guests with ease. Tonight, only 2 places were set, one at each opposing end, the vast expanse of wood between them feeling like a battlefield. Sebastian was already there, standing by the massive stone fireplace, a glass of dark red wine in his hand. He turned as she entered, his eyes sweeping over her, taking in the borrowed clothes, her rain-washed pallor. He gestured curtly to the far end of the table. The silence during the meal was a physical weight, broken only by the faint, sharp clinking of silverware against porcelain. The food was exquisite, a clear broth followed by roasted pheasant, but it tasted like ash in Marianne's mouth. She forced herself to eat, knowing she needed the strength, all while feeling his gaze on her from the far end of the table. Finally he spoke, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "I find it difficult to comprehend," he began, his tone sharp and clinical, as if he were dissecting an insect. "The Holts were a pillar of society. For your uncle to simply cast you out seems extreme." Marianne placed her fork down, her dignity a fragile shield against his probing questions. She met his gaze across the chasm of polished wood. "My father's investments were not as sound as society believed, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And my uncle values his coin more than his blood. When he discovered the estate was worth less than the debts owed against it, he saw no further use for me." Sebastian swirled the wine in his glass, his expression unreadable. "And you have no other family? No one to turn to?" "None who would take me in," she answered, the admission costing her. "I am a penniless relation, a burden." He fell silent again, but his eyes never left her, and Marianne felt as though he were searching for a lie, for some sign of the opportunistic schemer he clearly believed her to be. The meal concluded in that same chilling formality, and she was dismissed with a curt nod, retreating to the suffocating comfort of her room with a sense of profound relief. Sleep, however, refused to come. The velvet chaise lounge was soft, the fire warm, but her mind was a maelstrom. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, weighted down by the oppressive silence of history and secrets. Unable to bear the confines of the room any longer, she slipped out, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floors of the hallway. She wandered without direction, a ghost haunting the halls of her own past, drawn deeper into the heart of the sleeping manor. She found herself in a long gallery, the walls lined with portraits of Ravensworth ancestors. Stern-faced men in armor and ruffs stared down at her, their painted eyes seeming to follow her every move. The women were severe, draped in jewels and stiff silks, their expressions uniformly proud and unyielding. It was a lineage of power and conquest, of cold, hard ambition. And then she saw it. Tucked away in a darker corner, almost an afterthought, was a portrait that was utterly different. It was a woman, breathtakingly beautiful, with Sebastian's dark hair and piercing winter sky eyes. But where his gaze was cold and hard, hers was filled with a profound, gentle sorrow. Her smile was a sad, fragile thing, a ghost of happiness on a face that seemed to know only grief. Marianne felt an inexplicable pull, a sense of kinship with this long-dead duchess. "My mother," the voice, soft and startlingly close, made her jump. Sebastian stood in the shadows at the end of the gallery, his own eyes fixed on the portrait. He moved into the faint moonlight filtering through the tall windows, his expression unguarded for a fleeting moment. "She was not suited to the harsh realities of this family," he said, his voice lower, softer than she had ever heard it. It was a voice stripped of its icy armor, revealing a hint of the man beneath. Marianne couldn't tear her eyes from the painting. "She looks so gentle," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "It's a sad smile." The observation, so simple and true, struck a nerve. The mask slammed back into place, his jaw tightened, and the coldness returned to his eyes, extinguishing the brief flicker of warmth. "She was weak," he said, the words sharp and cruel. He turned away from the portrait, from her, and retreated back into the shadows, leaving her alone with the sorrowful ghost on the wall. But it was too late. For the first time, Marianne felt a flicker of empathy for the cold, hard man who had hurt her so deeply. She sensed that his cruelty was not a natural state, but a fortress built around a core of profound, old sorrow. Meanwhile, in the servants' hall, the arrival of Miss Holt was the sole topic of conversation. The air buzzed with gossip and speculation. "Mark my words, she's an opportunist," Mr. Finch declared, polishing a silver candlestick with a vigor that betrayed his agitation. "He throws her over 5 years ago, and now that she's destitute, she shows up on his doorstep in the middle of a storm. It's a scheme, plain and simple. She's scheming her way back into his life, hoping for a title." Mrs. Gable, mending a tear in a linen sheet, looked up, her expression stern. "And I say you're a cynical old fool, Finch. Did you see the state of her?" The girl's shoes were worn through to the soles. Her hands were raw. That wasn't the despair of a schemer, it was the despair of a soul at the end of its tether. She was desperate, not devious. A young housemaid named Clara, barely 16 and new to the manor, listened with wide, curious eyes. She had seen Miss Holt's face when Mrs. Gable had wrapped the blanket around her, the raw, bone-deep relief that had nothing to do with luxury and everything to do with simple human kindness. Later that night, on her way to her own small room in the attic, Clara crept along the west wing corridor. On a windowsill, she had found a small cluster of late-blooming violets, their purple heads bowed against the glass. She plucked them carefully, and leaving them in a small glass of water on the table beside Marianne's bed was a small, secret act of kindness. A silent message that not everyone in this cold, imposing house wished her ill. In his own vast, lonely chamber, Sebastian was jolted from a fitful sleep, his heart hammering against his ribs. The nightmare was already fading, but the images clung to him like smoke, acrid and suffocating, a chaotic collage of terror. His father's face, not as it was in his final portrait, but as it was that night, purple with rage, veins standing out on his thick neck. The sharp, sickening sound of splintering wood, a sound he would never forget. A horse's terrified, high-pitched scream, cut short, the cold sting of rain on his own face, just like the rain that had brought her to his door tonight. And through it all, one image, clear and sharp as glass. Marianne's face at the ball, the shock and hurt in her eyes as his cruel words struck home. He sat bolt upright, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hand went instinctively to his temple, his fingers tracing the faint, silvery line of the scar that was hidden there. It throbbed with a phantom pain, a constant, physical reminder of his failure. He was furious. Furious with the past that would not stay buried, and furious with himself for the unwilling, unwelcome concern that had taken root in his chest the moment he saw her standing in the storm. He wanted to despise her. He wanted to believe Finch, to see her as a calculating woman trying to take advantage of him. It would be so much easier. But her quiet resilience, the dignity she clung to in the face of his coldness, the memories her very presence evoked, were cracking the foundations of the fortress he had spent 5 years building. The nightmare was a terrifying confirmation. His trauma was still raw, and Marianne Holt, the one person he had tried to push furthest away, was the one person who threatened to bring it all crashing down. The Duke's attempt to recover was immediate, his voice turning to steel, the brief flicker of vulnerability extinguished as if it had never been. "I was speaking metaphorically of the path your life has taken, Miss Holt," he clipped out, his eyes daring her to challenge him. "A young woman of your station, alone and unprotected, is on a dangerous road indeed, "Do not read more into it." But it was too late. The denial was too quick, the explanation too hollow. It did not feel like a metaphor. It felt like a memory, a vivid, terrible memory that had clawed its way to the surface against his will. Marianne said nothing, merely lowered her gaze back to the book in her hands, her silence a more potent accusation than any argument she could have made. He held her gaze for a moment longer, his jaw a rigid line of defiance, before turning sharply and striding from the library, the sound of his boots on the polished floor echoing like hammer blows. She remained frozen, the Duke's words replaying in her mind. Asterisk. What road? He wasn't talking about a metaphor. He was talking about a real road. That night, asterisk, the narrative she had clung to for 5 years, a simple, painful story of a cruel man and a jilted girl, began to crumble at the edges. It was a story that had defined her, explained her fall from grace, and fueled her resentment. But what if it wasn't the whole story? What if his cruelty at the ball was not the beginning of the tale, but the middle of a chapter she had never been allowed to read? The storm, which had been a relentless, roaring beast, now seemed to quiet, its fury turning inward to match the tempest in her own mind. The rain still beat against the tall, arched windows of the library, but it was a muffled, distant sound, the world outside fading as the world within her fractured. She was no longer just a victim of his past cruelty. She was an investigator, and the first clue to a 5-year-old mystery had just been dropped carelessly at her feet. The storm showed no signs of abating the next day, trapping them in the oppressive quiet of the manor. The air between her and the Duke was thick with unspoken words, a tension so palpable it felt like a third presence in every room. To escape it, and to escape the swirling vortex of her own thoughts, Marianne found herself drawn back to the one place in the house that felt like a sanctuary, the vast, 2-story library. The scent of old paper, leather, and beeswax was a balm to her frayed nerves. Sunlight, weak and watery, struggled through the high windows, illuminating swirling dust motes that danced in the still air like tiny, silent ghosts. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, the titles a litany of forgotten worlds and ancient knowledge. It was here, in this temple of words, that she felt a semblance of her old self, the girl who loved stories more than society balls. Her hand stopped on a small, slim volume bound in worn, dark green leather. The title was embossed in faded gold, asterisk, Sonnets of Sorrow, asterisk. She pulled it from the shelf, the book falling open in her hands to a page marked with a faded, pressed violet. A poem about a love lost not to betrayal but to circumstance was heavily annotated in a delicate, feminine hand. The words were heartbreakingly beautiful, and Marianne found herself completely absorbed, tracing the faint pencil marks, feeling a strange connection to the woman who had read these lines so long ago. My mother believed poetry could give a voice to sorrows that were too deep for words. Sebastian's voice, quiet and devoid of its usual icy edge, came from the doorway. He had entered so silently she hadn't noticed. He stood there, not as the formidable Duke, but simply as a man, his gaze fixed on the book in her hands. He walked towards her, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. He didn't stop at a polite distance, but came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell the faint, clean scent of rain-washed air and sandalwood that clung to his clothes. That was her favorite, he said, his voice a low murmur. She marked every page that ever made her weep. Marianne looked from the book to his face. The firelight from the grand hearth softened his harsh features, warming the cool grey of his eyes. The scar at his temple seemed less a mark of violence and more one of vulnerability in the gentle light. The notes, they are as beautiful as the poems themselves, she said, her own voice barely a whisper. She pointed to a line in the margin. She wrote, "Grief is but love, persisting." A profound sadness settled over Sebastian's features, a genuine, unguarded sorrow that mirrored the expression in his mother's portrait. She had a great deal of love, he said quietly, and a great deal of grief to match. For a long, breathless moment, the hostility that had defined their every interaction for 5 years simply vanished. They were not duke and destitute petitioner, not scornful aristocrat and ruined merchant's daughter. They were just two people, standing in a quiet library, sharing a moment of understanding over a book of sad poems. The chasm between them, once so vast and impassable, seemed to shrink until it was nothing more than a breath of shared air. "I believe she was right," Marianne said, her eyes meeting his. "About poetry giving sorrow a voice." His gaze held hers, and in their depths she saw not a monster, but a man carrying a burden so heavy it had reshaped him. The connection was a fragile, terrifying thing, a spark of warmth in the frozen landscape of her heart. It complicated everything. How could she reconcile this man, the one who spoke of his mother with such gentle pain, with the brute who had humiliated her, or the liar who was so clearly hiding a dark secret about that night? The moment stretched, taut and shimmering, before it was broken by the distant, discordant clang of the great hall bell. Sebastian blinked, and the mask of the Duke slammed back into place. He took a step back, the space between them once again a cold, empty gulf. "You will excuse me," he said, his voice once more formal and remote. He turned and left the library, leaving Marianne with the book of poems, her heart beating a confused and troubled rhythm. Later that afternoon, seeking a task, any task, to occupy her hands and quiet her mind, Marianne wandered towards the servants' wing. She found the young maid, Clara, the one with the wide, kind eyes, struggling at the bottom of a grand staircase with a mountain of fresh linens. The girl was small, and the load was immense, threatening to topple and send pristine white sheets tumbling onto the dusty floor. "Here, let me help you with that," Marianne said, stepping forward without a second thought. Clara looked up, startled and flustered. "Oh no, miss, you mustn't. You'll soil your dress." The dress was a borrowed one of Mrs. Gable's, a simple grey wool, but it was far finer than anything Marianne had worn in months. She looked down at it, then back at Clara's straining face. "It is only a dress," she said with a small smile, "and these look far too heavy for one person." She gathered a thick armful of the clean, lavender-scented sheets, ignoring the twinge of protest from her own tired muscles. Together, they began the slow ascent up the winding servants' stairs. From the far end of the hall, Mr. Finch observed the scene, his thin lips curling into a sneer of supreme disdain. He saw not an act of kindness, but a calculated performance. The destitute young woman, playing the part of the humble, helpful guest. It was, in his mind, just another facet of her scheme to ingratiate herself, to weave her way into the fabric of the household. He turned away in disgust, his certainty in her duplicity solidifying into fact. From the landing above, another pair of eyes watched the exchange. Mrs. Gable, on her way to the west wing, paused, her hands resting on the polished banister. She saw Marianne without hesitation lift the heavy burden, her movements full of a natural grace and compassion. She saw the genuine smile she offered the young maid, and in that simple, unthinking act of kindness, Mrs. Gable saw the truth of Marianne's character. This was no schemer. This was a good, decent young woman, beaten down by misfortune but not broken by it. The housekeeper's jaw firmed, and her resolve to protect the girl from the cold cynicism of this house and from the Duke's own tormented soul hardened into tempered steel. Just as Marianne and Clara reached the top of the stairs, the front door of the manor was thrown open with a crash that echoed all the way from the great hall. A blast of cold, wet wind swept through the corridors, carrying with it the sound of a frantic, shouting voice. A moment later, a man appeared, a messenger, soaked to the skin and splattered from head to foot with mud. He clutched a sealed letter in his hand as if it were his lifeline. "An urgent dispatch for His Grace," the man gasped, his chest heaving. "From Lord Ashworth." Finch intercepted him, his expression one of extreme annoyance at the mud being tracked across his pristine floors. He took the letter with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated, and carried it towards the Duke's study. Marianne, her curiosity piqued by the sheer drama of the arrival, lingered near the landing. The door to the study was slightly ajar, and she could see Sebastian take the letter. She watched as he broke the wax seal. She saw his face as he read the words on the parchment. It was a transformation more shocking than any she had yet witnessed. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a waxy, deathly pale. His knuckles, where he gripped the letter, were bone white. The mask of cold indifference, the fortress of his composure, did not just crack, it shattered. For a moment, he looked utterly lost, haunted, like a man staring into the face of his own damnation. Then, with a sudden, violent movement, his hand clenched, crumpling the parchment into a tight, mangled ball. He stood there for a long moment, his shoulders rigid, his breathing ragged, before he seemed to remember himself, striding to the door and closing it with a quiet, definitive click. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the messenger's frantic arrival. Marianne leaned back against the wall, her own heart pounding in sympathy. Lord Ashworth. The name meant nothing to her, but the effect of his words on Sebastian was profound. This was the source of the danger she had sensed. The slip of the tongue about the road, the secret sorrow over his mother, and now this letter from a malevolent uncle. It was all connected. The puzzle pieces were beginning to form a picture, and it was one of dark, terrible secrets. Her fear, the shame that had driven her to his doorstep, was slowly being burned away, replaced by the hot, bright flame of a burning, desperate curiosity. She was no longer a beggar seeking shelter. She was a woman on the hunt for the truth, and she would not leave Ravensworth Manor until she found it. The storm finally broke with the dawn, its fury spent. A fragile, watery sunlight filtered through the clouds, painting the rain-washed world in shades of silver and grey. The oppressive atmosphere within the manor, however, had only intensified. The air was thick with the residue of last night's tension, a silence that was heavier and more suffocating than the roar of the storm. Needing to breathe air that was not saturated with secrets and unspoken accusations, Marianne slipped out of a side door into the gardens. The grounds were a scene of elegant devastation. Rose petals were scattered like bloody confetti across the manicured lawns, and a great limb had been torn from an ancient oak, its raw white wood a wound against the dark bark. She walked, aimless at first, her borrowed boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. She was drawn away from the pristine formality of the main gardens, towards the periphery of the estate, where nature was allowed a wilder, more untamed expression. Here, nestled behind a copse of skeletal birch trees and shrouded in a thick blanket of ivy, stood a dilapidated, disused stable block. It was a relic from another era, its stone walls crumbling and its slate roof sagging in the middle, like a broken spine. Most people would have passed it by, an ugly cousin to the grand, active stables near the front of the manor. But for Marianne, it felt like a destination. A cold, prickling sensation traced its way up her arms, a sense of dread and grim purpose. The door, its wood warped and green with moss, was not locked. It groaned open under her tentative push, the sound of protesting hinges loud in the quiet air. The interior was a tomb of dust and decay. Thick cobwebs, heavy and grey as funeral shrouds, draped from the rafters, and the air was thick with the smell of rot, damp earth, and the ghostly scent of long-vanished horses. Sunlight struggled through a single grime-caked window, illuminating a cavern of forgotten things, rusted farm implements, piles of rotting sacks, and empty, decaying stalls. In the very center of the space, dominating the gloom, was a large, shapeless object, covered by a heavy, dust-laden canvas tarp. It was the only thing that seemed to have been deliberately concealed. Her heart began a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. She approached it, her boots stirring up clouds of dust that danced in the single beam of light. With trembling hands, she took a corner of the heavy canvas. It was stiff and smelled of mildew. She pulled. The tarp resisted for a moment, then slid away with a dry, rasping sound, releasing a fresh cloud of dust that made her cough. And there it was. It was the wreck of a carriage. Not just old, but violently broken. One wheel was completely shattered, its spokes jutting out like broken bones. The driver's seat was torn from its mounting, and the entire frame was canted at a sickening angle. It was a skeleton, picked clean by time and neglect, but the ghost of its former elegance still clung to it. Faded gilding traced the edges of the door panels, and through the grime and rot, a crest was still visible. It was the snarling beast and thorny rose of the Ravensworth coat of arms. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, filled her. This was not just any carriage. This was his carriage. Her eyes were drawn to the door panel nearest her. A long, deep scratch, almost a gouge, ran diagonally across it, tearing through the crest. It looked as though it had been scraped violently against stone or a tree. Hesitantly, she reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing the interior. The velvet seats, once a rich burgundy, were now a mottled, faded brown, torn in several places and blooming with mildew. And on the seat directly behind the driver, there was a dark stain, a large, ominous stain that had soaked deep into the torn velvet. its edges blurred by time but its shape still horribly suggestive. It was the color of old rust, of dried blood. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. The road. Asterisk. You should never have been on that road. It was too dangerous that night. Asterisk. The accident. The wrecked carriage. The stain. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture of violence and horror. The public humiliation. The broken courtship. It was all a lie, a facade constructed to hide this wreck, this secret. Her heartbreak, the simple, clean pain she had nursed for 5 years, began to morph into a complex, terrifying mix of anger, horror, and a profound, unwilling empathy for the man who had so cruelly pushed her away. Deeply unsettled, her mind reeling, Marianne fled the stable block. The image of the wrecked carriage burned into her mind. She didn't run to the Duke's study. She didn't seek out the cold cynicism of Mr. Finch. She sought the one person in this house who had shown her a shred of genuine human warmth. She found Mrs. Gable in the main kitchen, overseeing the preparation of the midday meal. The housekeeper looked up as Marianne entered, and the smile on her face faltered when she saw the girl's pale, stricken expression. "Miss Holt? Dear child, you look as if you've seen a ghost," Mrs. Gable said, wiping her hands on her apron and leading Marianne to a small wooden stool near the warmth of the massive cooking hearth. Marianne clasped her trembling hands in her lap. "Mrs. Gable," she began, her voice low and urgent. "The old stable block, behind the birch trees. There is a carriage inside, a wrecked one." The change in the housekeeper's demeanor was instantaneous. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a guarded, fearful expression. She glanced around the bustling kitchen, then leaned in closer to Marianne, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You should not have been there, miss. That part of the grounds is not for guests. Tell me about the carriage," Marianne pressed, her own voice a whisper now. "Please, I have to know." Mrs. Gable's face was a portrait of conflict. Her loyalty to Sebastian, whom she had known since he was a boy, was warring with the undeniable affection and pity she felt for the young woman before her. She wrung her hands in her apron, her gaze darting towards the kitchen door as if expecting the Duke himself to appear. "It's not my place," she began, but then she looked into Marianne's eyes, saw the desperate plea there, and her resolve crumbled. She let out a long, shaky breath. "There was an accident," she whispered, the words tasting like treason on her tongue. "The night of the Weatherby ball, 5 years ago." She paused, her eyes filling with a sad, distant memory. The old Duke, Sebastian's father, he was a hard man, a cruel man, especially after his wife, the Duchess, passed away. He blamed Master Sebastian for everything that went wrong, for every joy that was missing from his life. He had a terrible, violent temper. She leaned in even closer, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "He and Master Sebastian had a dreadful argument before the ball that night. A truly awful one. I heard the shouting from the hall. It was about you, miss. The old Duke, he would not have his son and heir seriously courting a merchant's daughter, no matter how respectable." The confirmation sent a fresh chill through Marianne. Colder than any storm, it was about her, all of it. "The rage in him that night," Mrs. Gable continued, her eyes wide with the memory. "It was something terrible to behold, like a demon was wearing his skin." She shook her head, pulling back, as if she had already said too much. "That's all I know, miss. That's all I can say. It was a terrible time, a time of great sorrow for this house. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. It was the key, the piece that unlocked the entire puzzle." Marianne left the kitchen, her mind a whirlwind. As she crossed the rear courtyard, heading back towards the main house, a voice, sharp and sneering, cut through the air. "Snooping for secrets to sell, Miss Holt?" Mr. Finch stood by the kitchen entrance, a basket of polished silver in his hands, his face pinched with smug accusation. He had seen her leaving the direction of the old stables. "Or perhaps looking for something to use as leverage, a way to secure your position here more permanently. 5 years ago, even 2 days ago, such an accusation would have mortified her, reduced her to tears of shame and denial. But the girl who had arrived drenched and desperate at the gates of Ravensworth was gone. In her place was a woman who had glimpsed the truth behind the lies." She stopped and turned to face him, her spine straight, her gaze clear and direct. The butler's sneer faltered slightly under the unexpected force of her stare. "I am looking for the truth, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a newfound strength that surprised them both. "Something this house seems to have very little of." She held his gaze for a moment longer, letting her words sink in, before turning her back on his stunned, indignant face and walking away. Sebastian was losing control, and he knew it. Finch, deeply offended and more convinced than ever of Marianne's malevolent intentions, had gone straight to him, reporting in detail how he had found the woman skulking around the old stables. The news, combined with the lingering poison of his uncle's letter, had pushed the Duke to a precipice. Her presence, her questions, her quiet, relentless digging, was unraveling a secret he had kept buried for 5 years at immense personal cost. He felt cornered, the walls of his carefully constructed fortress crumbling around him. There was only one option left, one final, desperate gambit to regain control, to put the ghost of his past, and the woman who was resurrecting it, back in a box. He summoned her to his study. The room was the heart of his power, a masculine space of dark wood, worn leather, and the smell of old books and fine brandy. A fire burned in the hearth, but it offered no warmth against the chill in the room. Sebastian stood behind his massive mahogany desk, his hands braced on its surface, a general surveying a battlefield. He watched her enter, his face an unreadable mask of cold formality. "Miss Holt, please, sit," he said, gesturing to a single hard-backed chair placed directly before the desk. It was not an invitation, it was a command, an interrogation. Marianne did as he asked, her posture erect, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She would not show him her fear. He let the silence stretch, a tactic designed to intimidate, to unnerve. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold, detached, and utterly businesslike. "It has become clear that your current situation is untenable, both for you and for this household. It is not appropriate for you to remain here indefinitely." He paused, picking up a letter from his desk. "I have, however, taken the liberty of arranging a solution. I have an elderly aunt, the Dowager Marchioness of Pembroke, who resides in the north, in Northumberland. She is in need of a paid companion. The position would afford you a respectable home, a modest but steady income, and a place in society, albeit a quiet one." He placed the letter down, his eyes meeting hers. They were cold, hard stones. "It is the best solution for everyone. It will provide you with the security and respectability you have lost. And it would get her hundreds of miles away from him, from his secrets, from the wrecked carriage in the old stable. It was a banishment, wrapped in the guise of charity, a bribe to buy her silence and her absence." Marianne looked from his cold, unyielding eyes to the crackling fire, then back again. She saw the desperation behind the mask, the hunted look of an animal caught in a trap of its own making. The offer was a final, frantic attempt to keep the past buried, and in that moment she knew she would not let him. She would not be managed, dismissed, and sent away again. She rose slowly from the chair, her movements fluid and deliberate. "I am not a problem to be managed, Your Grace," she said, her voice shaking only slightly, "and I will not be sent away like a disobedient child." She took a step towards the desk, towards him, closing the space he had so carefully put between them. His composure finally fractured, a flicker of raw panic in his eyes. "I am a woman to whom you owe an explanation," she continued, her voice gaining strength, fueled by 5 years of pain and a lifetime of unanswered questions. She leaned forward, placing her hands on the polished surface of his desk, meeting his shocked gaze with an intensity that matched his own. "I refuse your offer. I am not going anywhere." Then she delivered the final devastating blow, her voice dropping to a low, demanding whisper that sliced through his defenses. "Tell me about the carriage. Tell me about the road. Tell me why you lied." His carefully constructed world shattered. For 5 long years, Duke Sebastian Ravensworth had been a fortress, his walls built of ice and disdain, his every action governed by a cold, brutal control. Now, under the quiet, unwavering force of her demand, the fortress crumbled into dust. The question was not a shout, but a key turning in a lock he had thought rusted shut forever. His shoulders, which had been held in a posture of rigid, aristocratic arrogance, slumped forward as if a physical weight had just been dropped upon them. He staggered back a step, away from the desk, away from her, his hand coming up to press against the faint scar at his temple, as if to hold his very thoughts together. The mask of the feared Duke dissolved, and for the first time, Marianne saw the man trapped beneath it. His eyes wide, not with anger, but with the raw, hunted agony of a soul that had been running for too long. The air in the study, once his seat of absolute power, was now thick with the ghosts of his past, swirling around him, choking him. He finally lowered his hand, his gaze dropping to the rich Persian rug, unable to meet her eyes. When he spoke, his voice was unrecognizable. The crisp, cutting cadence was gone, replaced by a raw, broken rasp that was the sound of a man being flayed alive by his own memories. "The carriage," he began, the words tearing from his throat. "The road, the lie, they are all the same story, a story that began and should have ended with my father." He moved then, not with his usual predatory grace, but with the unsteady gait of an old man, collapsing into the large leather chair behind his desk. He didn't sit like a duke, he sank into it, burying his face in his hands. The confession, when it came, was a torrent. A poisoned floodgate opened after years of pressure. "My father," he said, his voice muffled by his hands, "despised weakness, and he despised anything that was not born of our own world. He saw love as a weakness. He saw your family, your father's honest work, as a contamination." He looked up then, and the pain in his eyes was so profound it stole Marianne's breath. "He saw my affection for you as the ultimate betrayal. He believed I was squandering the Ravensworth name, the bloodline, on a merchant's daughter." The words were spoken with such self-loathing that Marianne flinched. "The night of the Weatherby ball, he summoned me to this very room. He had heard the whispers, the talk that my courtship was serious, the rage in him. It was nothing I had ever seen before. He told me I was to end it, not just end it, but scorch the earth of it. He wanted me to humiliate you, to make the break so absolute, so public, that no one would ever again link our names. He gave me an ultimatum." Sebastian's voice cracked. "He said if I did not cast you aside, he would personally see to the ruin of your father. He spoke of calling in markers, of spreading rumors on the exchange, of using the full weight of his name to crush your family's business until there was nothing left but dust. He would have done it. He would have enjoyed it." Marianne sank back into her own chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The cruelty at the ball, the words that had echoed in her nightmares for years, were not Sebastian's own. They were a script written by a monster. "So I did it," Sebastian whispered, his gaze lost in the past. "I became the monster he demanded. I used his words, his cruelty. I stood in that ballroom and I broke your heart, and a piece of my own soul with it. I told myself it was to save you, to save your family. I thought if you hated me, truly despised me, you would be safe. You would be so far from me, so far from this house and its poison, that my father and his world could never touch you again. It was a desperate, foolish, arrogant choice. The choice of a boy trying to play a man's game." He fell silent, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. Marianne's own pain, the sharp sting of her humiliation, was receding, replaced by a vast, horrified pity. She saw it now, the impossible choice he had faced, a choice between her heart and her family's very survival. "But it didn't end there," Sebastian continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a near inaudible murmur of horror. "After the ball I couldn't breathe. The air in that house was thick with my own self-disgust. I left. I needed to ride, to feel the wind and the rain, to outrun the thing I had become. As I was leaving, I saw him, my father. He was in the courtyard, drunk, his face purple with fury even in his victory. He was shouting at a groom, demanding his own carriage be brought around. I knew that look in his eyes. It was a madness. He wasn't going home. He was going out to cause pain, to break something, to hurt someone. I couldn't let him. I had my own horse saddled, and I followed him. The scene played out in Marianne's mind, vivid and terrible. The two men, father and son, fleeing into the stormy night, one consumed by rage, the other by guilt. The roads were slick with rain. Sebastian's voice was a ghost of a whisper. It was dark, the moon hidden by clouds. I caught up to him on the old forest road. He saw my carriage behind him, and in his drunken paranoia, he thought I was defying him. He thought I was chasing him down to argue, to continue to plead your case. He stood up, roaring, and whipped his horses into a frenzy. They bolted. The carriage swayed violently. He lost control. Sebastian's eyes closed, but the images were clearly playing behind his lids. There was a sharp bend in the road, by the old stone bridge. He never even tried to take it. The carriage went straight on, into the ravine. The sound, God, the sound. Splintering wood, the shriek of the horses, then silence. He took a ragged breath, his hand instinctively going to the scar on his temple. I scrambled down the embankment. The carriage was a wreck, just a pile of shattered wood and twisted metal. He was trapped inside, pinned under a broken timber. I pulled him from the wreckage. A piece of the door frame. It was splintered like a spear. It caught me as I was pulling him free. He touched the scar. A reminder. Marianne felt a wave of nausea. The scratch on the carriage door, the dark stain on the velvet. It was all real. He didn't die instantly, Sebastian said, his voice hollow. He was broken, bleeding, but his eyes were still full of that same terrible, tyrannical pride. He grabbed my coat, his grip surprisingly strong, and with his last breaths, he didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't speak of my mother. He gave me one last command. Sebastian's voice dripped with a bitterness so profound it was chilling. He looked at me and he said, "Protect the name, the honor of this family. You will tell them I died at home. A sudden affliction of the heart. You will not let this night bring shame upon us." He died then, his last act not one of love, but of preserving a lie. The weight of it, the sheer horror, was crushing. To be forced to cover up the ugly death of the man who had just forced you to destroy the woman you loved. But the story, impossibly, grew darker. I was not alone. The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. As I stood there, covered in mud and my father's blood, a figure emerged from the trees on the other side of the ravine. My uncle, Lord Ashworth. He had been at the ball. He had seen the argument. He had seen my father leave, and he had followed us both, smelling blood in the water as he always does. He saw everything. The chase, the crash, my father's dying words. He stood there, on the opposite bank, and he smiled. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with sickening finality. "He has been blackmailing you ever since," Marianne whispered, the realization dawning on her. Sebastian nodded, a single weary gesture of defeat. "From that moment on, my life has not been my own. He holds the threat of ruin over my head, not just my ruin, but the complete disgrace of the Ravensworth name. He could twist the story, paint me as a patricide who chased his own father to his death over a woman. With my father's reputation for temper and my known affection for you, it would be a plausible, delicious scandal. So I paid him. I have been paying him for 5 years. In money, in political favors, in silence. My cruelty to you, my isolation, this cold, empty life I have built, it was all a cage. A desperate, misguided attempt to push you so far away that you could never be touched by this scandal, never be used as a pawn by my uncle. I let you hate me to save you. I became a monster in your eyes to keep you safe from the real monsters." His voice finally broke, the confession ending in a choked sob. "The scar on my face is a constant reminder of that night, of my failure. My failure to stand up to my father. My failure to protect you. My failure to protect anyone." He finally looked at her, his eyes stripped bare, showing all the pain and regret and self-loathing he had carried alone for half a decade. The formidable Duke was gone, and in his place was a broken man, drowning in the wreckage of his past. The story was so much bigger, so much more terrible than she could have ever imagined. Her own pain, which had been the sun around which her world had orbited for 5 years, seemed small and distant now, a pale moon to his raging, fiery star of agony. All the anger, all the resentment she had harbored, dissolved in a tidal wave of compassion so powerful it left her breathless. Without thinking, without considering the propriety of the act, she rose from her chair and went to him. She knelt on the floor beside his chair, in the space where a petitioner would kneel, and she reached out, placing her hand gently on his arm. The muscles there were corded with tension, tight as wound steel. "You carried this all alone," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "All this time." He flinched at her touch, as if expecting a blow. Then slowly, tentatively, he relaxed, leaning into her touch like a man starved of human contact. He turned his hand over and weakly curled his fingers around hers, his grip surprisingly fragile. The great, feared Duke of Ravensworth, clinging to her hand like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. They stayed like that for a long, silent moment, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire, the air between them charged not with tension, but with the raw, painful, beautiful beginnings of healing. The past was not gone, but for the first time it was shared. The moment of fragile peace was shattered by a sharp, decisive knock on the study door. Sebastian stiffened, snatching his hand back as if burned, the mask of the Duke flying back into place, though it was a poor, cracked imitation of the original. "Enter," he called out, his voice strained. The door opened, and Mr. Finch stood there, his expression as impassive as ever, completely oblivious to the emotional cataclysm that had just occurred in the room. "Your Grace," the butler announced, his voice crisp and formal, "you have an unexpected visitor, Lord Ashworth." The name fell into the quiet room like a stone into a still pond, the ripples spreading outwards, cold and menacing. Time seemed to slow. Sebastian's face, which had just begun to regain some color, went bone white. He rose slowly from his chair, his movements stiff, his eyes fixed on the doorway, and then he appeared. Lord Ashworth swept into the room, a vision of expensive tailoring and reptilian charm. He was a handsome man in his late 50s, with silvered hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. Those eyes, small and glittering with malice, took in the scene in an instant. They landed first on Sebastian, noting his nephew's raw, disheveled state with a flicker of satisfaction. Then his gaze slid to Marianne, who was still kneeling by the chair. His eyes traveled over her, slow and appraising, a predatory interest dawning in their depths. The smile on his face widened. "Sebastian, my dear nephew," he purred, his voice smooth as poisoned silk. "I see you've found some company." He let his gaze linger on Marianne for a moment longer, a look of such calculated insult that she felt a desperate urge to cover herself. How delightful! "I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd call." He strolled further into the room, his presence sucking the very air from it, a physical manifestation of the threat Sebastian had lived under for 5 long years. "We have so much to discuss." The air in the study turned thin and sharp, the scent of old books and wood smoke suddenly tainted by the cloying, sweet smell of Lord Ashworth's cologne. Sebastian stood frozen, the fragile piece of his confession shattered into a million pieces. He was no longer a man unburdened. He was a target, illuminated and exposed. Ashworth's glittering eyes drank in the scene, the raw emotion on Sebastian's face, the kneeling woman beside him, and he understood everything. He held all the cards, and he was ready to play his winning hand. "My dear nephew," Ashworth purred, strolling over to the decanter of brandy on a side table and pouring himself a generous measure without asking. "You look unwell, and your little friend seems to have misplaced her chair." He took a sip of the brandy, his eyes never leaving them. "No matter. I am not here for social niceties. I find myself in a temporary state of financial embarrassment, a run of bad luck at the tables. I require a rather substantial sum to placate some gentlemen who lack my appreciation for sporting chance. Let us say £200,000. Sebastian's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his mind racing, the old fear coiling in his gut. "Ah, silence," Ashworth chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "The protest of a man with no argument, but that is merely the principal sum. There is also the matter of interest. My influence at court has waned of late. A word from the powerful Duke of Ravensworth, a seat on the board of the new colonial trading company. These things would go a long way to restoring my fortunes." He set the glass down, the sound a sharp crack in the tense silence. He walked towards the desk, his movements like those of a stalking cat. "You will do this for me, Sebastian. You will pay my debts, and you will restore my position. Or," he let the word hang in the air, savoring it, "or I will finally share the fascinating story of my brother's last moments. I will paint a picture for the broadsheets, for every gossip in London, a picture of a furious young heir, enraged that his father forbade his sordid affair with a penniless nobody." His eyes flicked to Marianne, a look of pure venom in them. An argument, a chase through a storm, a convenient, fatal accident. And now, 5 years later, the destitute mistress is back, installed in the very house where her lover murdered his own father to be with her. It will be the scandal of the century. It will ruin you. The world will see you for the patricide and degenerate you are." He smiled, a chilling reptilian expression of absolute triumph. He had laid out his terms. He had presented the ultimatum. And he had no doubt, none at all, that his terrified, guilt-ridden nephew would fold, just as he always had. But something was different this time. The fear that had been Sebastian's constant companion for 5 years was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was no longer the only thing he felt. He felt the warmth of Marianne's hand, still a phantom touch on his arm. He heard her whisper, "You carried this all alone, " He was not alone anymore. He looked at Marianne, who had risen to her feet and now stood, not behind him, but beside him, her chin held high, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury that mirrored his own. She was not a destitute mistress. She was a queen, and she was not afraid. And in that moment, neither was he. Sebastian straightened his shoulders, the movement slow and deliberate. He felt the weight of his father's legacy, the crushing burden of his uncle's blackmail, begin to lift. He was not the haunted boy in the ravine anymore. He was the Duke of Ravensworth, and this was his house. "No," Sebastian said. The word was quiet, but it cut through the air with the force of a blade. Ashworth blinked, his smile faltering. "What did you say?" "I said no," Sebastian repeated, his voice gaining strength, ringing with a newfound authority that made the very air in the room vibrate. "I will not give you another penny. I will not lift a single finger to help you. You have fed on my family, on my guilt, for the last time. You are a parasite, uncle, and your time as a guest in this house is over." Ashworth's face contorted with disbelief, then with rage. "You fool, I will ruin you. I will destroy everything you hold dear." "You will do nothing," Sebastian countered, taking a step forward, forcing his uncle to take a step back. "Because you are nothing." It was then that Marianne spoke, her voice clear and strong, without a single tremor of fear. "I know the truth, Lord Ashworth," she said, her gaze locking with his. The predator, faced with two united fronts, was momentarily stunned. "I know about the argument. I know about the crash. I know about the dying command and the blackmail that has followed, and I will testify in any court you choose. I will stand before the world and tell them what happened that night. Your story will be revealed for what it is, the malicious, self-serving lie of a desperate, pathetic man." The blood drained from Ashworth's face. The presence of a witness, a credible, articulate witness who knew the entire truth, was something he had never anticipated. His leverage, his entire house of cards, had just been set ablaze. His rage, stripped of its power, curdled into a desperate, violent fury. His eyes darted between them, and he fixed on the source of his ruin. With a guttural snarl, he lunged, not at Sebastian, but at Marianne. "You little bitch!" he roared, his hands outstretched like claws. He never reached her. In a movement so swift it was a blur, Sebastian intercepted him. The haunted, broken man was gone, replaced by a formidable force of pure, controlled power. He caught his uncle's wrist in a grip of iron, twisting it until Ashworth cried out in pain. He was taller, stronger, younger, and fueled by 5 years of suppressed rage. He spun his uncle around, grabbing the collar of his expensive coat, and began to physically force him from the room. "This is my house," Sebastian snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl as he propelled the struggling man through the doorway and into the grand hall. "My name." He shoved him towards the massive front doors, which Finch, his face a mask of shocked delight, had already thrown open. "And my honor." With a final, definitive heave, Sebastian threw his uncle out of the house. Lord Ashworth stumbled, lost his footing, and tumbled down the stone steps, landing in a heap on the wet gravel drive. He looked up, his face a mask of humiliation and fury, rain beginning to fall once more, spotting his ruined coat. Sebastian stood at the top of the steps, a towering, avenging figure against the light of the hall. "If you ever show your face here again," the Duke said, his voice now a chilling, quiet promise of retribution, "if you ever so much as breathe my name or hers again, I will not stop at exposing the truth of my father's death. I will unleash every resource I have to uncover every dirty secret, every corrupt deal, every sordid act of your entire miserable life. I will hunt you, I will beggar you, and I will bury you. Now get out." Ashworth scrambled to his feet, gave one last look of pure hatred, and fled into the darkness, the sound of his running footsteps on the gravel fading into the night. The parasite had been purged. In the quiet aftermath, the silence that descended was not tense or heavy, but clean and vast. Sebastian stood in the open doorway, the cool, rain-washed air on his face, his chest heaving. The power and the fury drained away, leaving him feeling hollowed out, exposed, and utterly vulnerable. He turned slowly and looked at Marianne, who stood in the center of the hall, her eyes shining with unshed tears. The great, feared Duke of Ravensworth had won the battle, but he knew the war for his own soul was not yet over. He walked back to her, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. He stopped before her, and for the first time, he looked at her with no walls, no masks, no secrets between them. He saw not the destitute woman he had taken in, but the strong, resilient woman who had just stood beside him and saved him from himself. "Marianne," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "can you forgive me? Not for the choice I was forced to make, but for the pain it cost you, for my cowardice. I should have trusted you. I should have come to you that very next day and told you the truth, instead of letting you believe for 5 years that I was a monster." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently cupped her cheek. "I am so sorry." A single tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. "There is nothing to forgive, Sebastian," she whispered, her voice catching. "We were both trapped by the past, by your father's cruelty and your uncle's greed. But now," she smiled, a real, radiant smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. "Now we are free." He searched her eyes, his heart pounding with a hope he had not dared to feel in years. "Is there any hope for us then?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "After all the lies, all the pain, is there anything left to build on?" She did not answer with words. She leaned in, rising on her toes, and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was not one of fiery passion, but of quiet, profound homecoming. It was a kiss of forgiveness, of acceptance, of a love that had been buried but had never truly died. It was the promise of a new beginning. Weeks later, the sun streamed through the tall windows of Ravensworth Manor, illuminating a house transformed. The oppressive Gothic gloom had lifted, replaced by a sense of light and air. The ghosts had been exorcised. Sebastian had been true to his word. He had quietly and discreetly used his vast resources to settle the Holt family's debts, restoring her father's name and ensuring her family's legacy was one of honor, not ruin. The final scene of their drama was not set in a fire-lit study or a shadowy hall, but in the gardens. The same gardens that had been ravaged by the storm were now being brought back to life. Under Marianne's gentle but firm direction, weeds were being cleared, overgrown roses were being pruned, and new, bright flowers were being planted in the once barren beds. She walked beside Sebastian, their conversation easy and light, their hands intertwined. He was no longer the feared Duke, a man isolated by his secrets. He was simply Sebastian, a man in love, his face relaxed and his laughter, a sound she had never heard before, surprisingly warm and frequent. "You have a gift for making things grow again," he said, looking at a newly planted bed of vibrant blue delphiniums that matched the color of her eyes. "Everything deserves a second chance to bloom," she replied, her fingers tightening around his. He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious now, but with a warmth that made her heart soar. He had asked her a question the night before, in the quiet of the library where they had first connected, a question that would define their future. "And what of my proposal, Marianne?" he asked softly. "Will you be the Duchess of Ravensworth? Will you be my wife?" She looked up at him, at the man she had hated, the man she had pitied, the man she now loved, with a depth and understanding that surpassed the simple infatuation of her youth. Theirs would not be a love born of ballrooms and polite society, but one forged in a storm, tested by secrets, and rebuilt on a foundation of absolute, unshakable truth. They were equals. They were partners. They had saved each other. "There is nothing I would want more," she said, her voice clear and full of joy. "Yes, Sebastian, I would be honored to be your Duchess." He smiled, a smile of pure, unadulterated happiness, and lowered his head to kiss her, a long, sweet kiss under the warm afternoon sun, a final, definitive seal on their new beginning. The storm was over, the sun was out, and in the heart of Ravensworth, love, against all odds, was finally in bloom.